welcome you all to this event. My name is Tony Vogt. I teach in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion. And I'm co-director with Professor Joseph Orozco of the Inaris Project for Future Alternatives and Alternative Futures. The Inaris Project was inspired by speculative writer Ursula K. Le Guin, in particular her critical utopian novel, The Dispossessed. The purpose of the project, which is sponsoring the event today, is to provide a forum to move beyond a world of racial, sexual, gender, and class oppression, to move to a world where there is no war, no empire, and where equality, mutual aid, and solidarity are the reigning virtues. So as much as possible, we're trying to provide a forum for conversations that allow us not only to envision, but to move toward that kind of world. So I'd like to present to you my co-director, Joseph Orozco.
Well, thank you all for coming to this event this afternoon by the Inaris Project. We're very excited to be able to have our authors here to speak with us today. And I want to acknowledge that this presentation today is with the assistance of the Corvallis chapter of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And this evening there will be a second presentation that the authors will be presenting along with, I believe, their short film that they've been working on, and they can talk a little bit about that. But that will be this evening at 7 p.m. at the Unitarian Fellowship. And so if you're interested in continuing the discussion with our authors, you can do that this evening at 7 p.m. So I want to thank Wilt for their assistance and working with us to bring these authors to Corvallis. So I won't say very much more to give time for us to be able to dialogue with the authors, but I want to welcome Cliff Ross and Marcy Rain to OSU. And they have just published a book with PM Press out of the Bay Area called Until the Rulers Obey, Voices from Latin American Social Movements, and has been receiving wide praise from various scholars in Latin American studies, and it brings together different voices from all around the continent about the new direction in Latin American social movements that have been changing the face of Latin American politics now for almost 10 years. And so we're really excited to be able to have them come out. Cliff and Marcy have been working in Latin America now for over 25 years, have been translators, have been editors of various works trying to capture the experiences of different kinds of Latin American organizers and activists. And so this is a big culmination of a lot of their work, this particular volume. And so we're really excited for them to be able to help us understand a little bit about the changes that are going on in Latin America and perhaps what that means for the United States as well. So I'll turn this over now to Cliff and Marcy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I want to start with a moment of gratitude. Thank you for taking this time to come and be here with us, and thanks very much to Will and Joseph and Tony and the Inaris Project for opening up this noontime space for us. And thanks also to all of the people who shared their stories with us for this book. There are 67 interviews in here, but more than 70 people, because some of the interviews bring in a few different individuals. And they're from 15 countries. We don't have all of the countries on the continents, but we do have a great majority of them. And we have people, whole range of social movements, many indigenous activists, organizers from communities who are resisting resource extraction, mining, and industrial agriculture. We have organizers on women's and LGBTQ issues, workers who are organizing either to take over their workplaces, to form cooperatives, or to form unions. We have people who have been organizing to occupy living spaces in the cities and in the countries because they have nowhere to live. We have people working on agroecology issues, a whole range of folks. The one omission, which will be straight up with you, beginning, we don't have a representation of Latin Americans, Afro-descendants, and there is some very valuable organizing there, and that we don't feature. So for that, we are sorry, but there is a great deal more. And I'll give you just a quick overview of what we'll do. Our takeaway point, one of our main takeaway points from all of the work that we did as we compiled these interviews and as we reflected on them, we were just impressed at the importance of independent and critical social movements as a force for change, and the role of these movements in bringing progressive governments to power, and then the need for them to continue mobilizing and holding these governments accountable. We'll talk a little bit about that piece, and then a little bit about another aspect, very, very inspiring, these movements' capacity to create alternative spaces and autonomous communities, and within them, new forms of governance. So I will turn you over to Cliff.
Well, this book came out of an experience. I was working in the 80s in Nicaragua in solidarity with the Sandinista revolution. I came back after that and was really very distressed to see it destroyed by what could only be called a terrorist war that was unleashed by the United States against the people of Nicaragua, and then elections which were essentially bought and paid for by Washington, D.C. I joined the Wobblies. I worked in a Wobbly print shop. We put out a book, the first book in English of Socratista writings in 1994. And Marcy and I met in 1997. We're actually married, just a little bit of personal information. She was working in unions, doing union work, and had been involved in social movement work for decades. And we made a really good partnership. We were both writers. And I was really pretty bitter about my experience with Nicaragua, not nearly as bitter as many of the Nicaraguans. And she encouraged me to go back to Nicaragua to get in touch with people and see what was going on there. So in 2004, I went back and I published a book of poetry that I had translated by Ernesto Cardenal, who was a priest and the Minister of Culture, Sandinista Minister of Culture. And I went back to interview him and his brother, Fernando Cardenal, who had been the Minister of Education. Really amazing people. They both had left the Sandinista Party, in the case of Ernesto denouncing it. And the party had become essentially a caudillo, a populist party run by a caudillo. Daniel Ortega had taken over what had been a guerrilla organization, a guerrilla party. That's a long story, we won't get into it. But it also reflects on a lot of the tendencies that we're currently seeing in Latin America today. But when I interviewed Ernesto, I was asking him about the new things going on in Latin America, and I was really interested in Lula, and I didn't know too much of what was going on because I'd just been in grad school, and for those of you who know anything at all about grad school, when you're in there, you have blinders on, and they whip you, they beat you until you get to the other side of it, and then you can take the blinders off and breathe again. But it's kind of like that, and I'm sorry to say that in such a way. But for those of you who are thinking about going to grad school, keep that in mind. So anyway, what happened was I asked him about Latin America, the current, what was going on there and what inspired him. He said, well, you have to check out Venezuela. Have you been to Venezuela? No. Well, you need to go to Venezuela. So having Ernesto Cardenal send me to Venezuela effectively, I went down in December of that year and was really interested, really excited by what I saw there under Hugo Chavez, Lieutenant Colonel, who had been elected in 1998. And suddenly, and also the price of oil had gone up about 10 times in just the intervening 6 months from the time that over the previous year. So they had a lot of money. They were swimming in money. and they had a lot. They were doing all kinds of projects. So I was really interested and very excited. I went back in 2005 and was invited to participate in the World Poetry Festival. I stayed on for a year and went on and decided I was going to travel through South America, fulfill a lifetime dream. And I began traveling through some of the progressive, what we now know, or it's generally called the pink tide governments. Is anyone familiar with that? I see some of us older folks nodding their heads. But for those of you who don't know what the pink tide governments are, it was a tide that came in the 1990s when the Washington Consensus broke down. Basically, Washington had been ruling Latin America essentially for the previous century, and it wasn't working. The short of it, that's the short answer. We're trying to cut our presentation down, so we won't go into all the experiments and all the problems with what had happened. But around 2000, there was the ebbing of the Washington Consensus and the new tide of the pink tide coming in. It wasn't red. It wasn't a red tide. It was a pink tide. They were social democrat parties. They were populist parties. But there wasn't anything really resembling socialism. Some of the governments were marketing. You had a marketing tag, which was called Socialism in the 21st Century, but essentially it's a very disputed term. Some would even argue an empty signifier. So at a certain point, I was traveling. I came back. I was teaching at a community college in Berkeley. I went down in summers to visit my friends in Venezuela, who I made a lot of friends. And then I met someone who we were talking about doing this book. And it originally was going to be just a book of 4 or 5 of the progressive governments and social movements under those, but I got a little bit manic and started expanding and decided I wanted to go to Colombia too, and I wanted to go, and this thing, and also more and more of the governments began emerging in Latin America, the left governments. So let me just kind of go through really quickly who they were. In Venezuela, as I mentioned, Hugo Chavez came in with the so-called Bolivarian Revolution. In Brazil, it was Lula with the Workers' Party. Those are the main first forces. The Sandinistas came back in 2006 in Central America, in Nicaragua. Much later, in Honduras, a sort of a moderately left-leaning president came into power in Honduras, Mel Zelaya. The FMLN came in to power as an electoral party with the electoral logic. In El Salvador, but meanwhile, in South America was where the real action was. You had in Ecuador, you had the Citizens Alliance with Rafael Correa coming into power. I believe it was in 2006. In Uruguay, it was the Frente Amplio, the Broad Front, of left organizations and parties that had come to power by organizing block by block in Montevideo and then into the countryside. In Paraguay, I happened to be there when Fernando Lugo came into power, called the Red Bishop. He was probably a little more pink than red, liberation theologian who left behind his office as bishop to serve as president in Paraguay. He was overthrown in the coup in 2011. And then there was Evo Morales, and in 2005 he was elected. He came to office in January of 2006. And so you have all these governments, and then you have Humala Ollanta in Peru, which people thought might be sort of lefty, and ended up not being quite. You have Bachelet in Chile, moderately left, and then you have the Kirchners, who are considered left, who came into power after the implosion in Argentina in 2000. So that's kind of the scenario we're looking at this, and it looks. From one point of view, if you were in the John Birch Society, it would be terrifying. But probably we don't have many of those people in this room, and it looks moderately hopeful that some left governments were coming to power. I'm just going to focus a little bit, because we have so little time today. I want to focus a little bit on one example of what the social movements learned from the 90s until the present time, and how to relate to these governments. First of all, I want to say that if you look at the economics of this thing, and some of us are really oriented toward looking at economics first and finding out how everything works from there on. If you look at the economics there, it really is the only difference between the right-wing governments of Latin America and the left-wing governments is that the left-wing governments have decided they're going to work against austerity. They're going to take some of the mining, the money coming from mining, and put it into welfare programs, social benefit programs, building a safety net. That's essentially the only difference. Because both the right wing and the left wing, Latin America has been pushed back into the beginnings of the 20th century for a lot of reasons, which maybe we'll go into tonight when we have more time, and into just extractivism of raw materials. And essentially even Venezuela is in a situation, in fact, in some ways I would argue, even worse, more pushed backwards. And so so all of these governments are essentially doing open pit mining for the most part. It's kind of a very common thing. There is enormous resistance building in the social movements. I mean, you can imagine if you have an oil well in your backyard and it's spewing oil all over your vegetable garden, you might be unhappy about this. This is essentially the image for what's going on all through Latin America now with the extractivist industries in the era of globalization, when Latin America is viewed no longer as a manufacturing center, but as a place where we just are going to go and take all the wealth out as much as we can possibly grab in this last little moment of history, the history of capitalism. So what this means in Ecuador, they have probably the longest. So they have the longest history of struggle with the progressive governments. In some ways, Chile also. Chile was in the 90s. The United States essentially decided to promote democracy in Latin America. It decided it didn't need dictatorships any longer, and so we would just kind of let everyone decide what they wanted. And the first democracy to emerge was, in the South American dictatorships in the South American scenario, really was the convergence, convergencia in Chile, which included the socialists and the communists. But there was no danger of anything really happening because they were working according to Pinochet's constitution. So the dictator, the U.S. government was saying, look at how good we're promoting these Democrats, and they're communists and socialists, but we don't even mind anymore because the Soviet Union is gone. In Ecuador, this whole new wave of social movement activity began in the 70s, but you have really a new spark happening in 1990 with the indigenous uprising in Ecuador. People didn't know that there were so many indigenous people in Ecuador until they began marching silently and occupying the cathedral, and many people saw indigenous people for the first time. Not that they weren't there all along, but the indigenous people decided they were going to build for electoral power, to take power. They organized a party called Pachakutik, and the Pachakutik was an indigenous party, but it included, because they recognized they needed to extend and they couldn't take power themselves, they needed to build with all the other social forces. And so what happened at that point, there was a little coup that lasted like a few hours, actually. The United States didn't recognize the people. One of the members was Pachakutik. They didn't win that one. So they had to go to the polls, and a lot of discredited presidents who were implementing neoliberal policies, the Washington Consensus and so forth. Finally, a man who looked like he was going to, he said he was with the people, he was I believe, a colonel, and Lucio Gutierrez, and he, with the help of Pachakutik, was elected I don't remember the year. I'm not going to try to sit here and look stupid trying to remember the year. But you can look that up on Wikipedia later. But what they did was, when he came to power, he said, okay, I'm going to bring all of the leaders of the Pachakutik into the government. So Nina Pacari was one of them. She was a foreign minister from Pachakutik. And they said, okay, now we're going to send her to the United States, he said, to sign a free trade agreement with the United States. Not only is he going to betray the social movements, but he's going to rub their nose in the betrayal. And so the social movements, they didn't know what to do. The Pachakutik was kind of like, well, what do we do? Do we break with this guy? They finally broke with him when he was on the verge of falling. Finally fell. The middle-class movement, the Forajidos, overthrew him. And it took the next 10 years for Pachakutik to begin to regain its base. And so what one of the people in the book was describing as a situation in which one person named Diogenes Lucio talked about Well, we learned a lesson. So I went around interviewing people. I interviewed Umberto Cholango, who is now the president of CONAI and being accused of terrorism, on terrorism charges under the populist or left government of Rafael Correa. And he said, well, we've learned quite a few lessons since that time. And Lucio Gutierrez, Diogenes Lucio, talked about how they changed this. They said, well, he says, well, we'll put lower profile people in, but not the leadership of the organization, because that would weaken the organization and weaken our ability to maintain a critical stance toward the government. That's why it was agreed that none of the national directors would take public office under Correa, despite the temptations to power. And Cholango goes on to talk about this as well, it's only an illusion that you're in power in the first place, in fact. So there's been this increasing awareness among popular movements, unfortunately not in Paraguay. The popular movements demobilized. They saw the right wing attacking Bishop Lugo, and so they backed off their agenda, and they supported him, and they threw their whole weight into his government. And so when the new government came in, not only did they lose their places in the government, but they also lost their agenda. They lost a huge part of their base. So this is a really important lesson, and it's repeated throughout the book. I mean, we were trying to find the themes in the book when we were wading through the material, and we had about twice this size that we had to edit it down to, and our editor kept saying, no, Finally he said, okay, we'll go with that one. And but when we finally came up, the themes of strategic relationships with power, especially in a context where extractivism, or what is called neo-extractivism, which is framed as South-to-South cooperation, because China is doing most of the extractivism now. Our communist brothers in China are doing taking the gold out, taking the iron out, and leaving behind the pits. And just to end on one little bit of information, just to give you an idea of the extractive industries. Gold in Nicaragua has now replaced cattle as the #1 export of the country. But the gold, 99.94% of the gold, the money from the gold, goes out of the country. So essentially, a 0.06% stays in the country. It represents 2.5% of the national budget. Now, why that is happening under the populist government of the Sandinista government of Daniel Ortega is a question that you might want to ask yourselves as something for a research topic in the future, but it's one I'm continuing to ask myself. But what I think is really interesting, and just to introduce what Marcy's going to talk about, what I think is most interesting about all this is that the social movements, in deciding to have very strategic relations with government, tactical projects, tactically working with the governments, they've begun to create autonomous spaces and building their own territory. And these are some of the most exciting things, I think, that come out of the book.
Yeah, it's interesting. We got very wrapped up in some of the debate between analysts and activists who believe that you need to change the world by trying to take power through the state. James Pector's being an example of that, and then the theory that you build power from below without interacting with the state at all. More of the perhaps John Holloway would be an example. But the interesting thing, the more we studied what people were telling us in this book, is a very great many of the activists and thinkers really don't see it as either or, but both and. So they will work to change government policy at the same time that they're building the alternatives that they need in the present moment. So I think there's a great variety of these kind of autonomous spaces and alternative projects, but there's a few things that they have in common. For one thing, the idea of occupying territory in one way or another is very important. Sometimes this is on a very small scale. We have an interview in here with a group of young people who built a community center in a working class neighborhood in Montevideo, Uruguay. And they serve meals, they have a community radio station, they organize urban gardens, they do a whole variety of things just within their neighborhood. And in fact, One of the people that Cliff talked to said, well, I don't work there anymore because I moved out of the neighborhood and we don't think it's right to work there if you're not living there. So this very local taking of spaces all the way on up to the extensive communities of the Zapatistas in Chiapas or the landless rural workers movement in Brazil, which is now 30 years old, began when industrial agriculture was displacing rural people. In order to have somewhere to live, they began taking over land. They now occupy an area of land that's as large as the state of Uruguay. So that's the MST. There are people who are taking over their spaces, their workspaces in factories, for example. Stop there because I want to, so the second thing, the workplace occupations and the MST both really illustrate the fact that most of these autonomous projects started out of necessity. They started out of the need for marginalized people to survive in the margins of capitalism, to make some space because they had no alternatives, so they made their own. The situation in Argentina that Cliff was referring to before the Kirchners took power, there was just an implosion of the country and great numbers of owners abandoning their factories. The workers needed to work, so they began taking over their factories. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie The Tape. It's a really interesting and visually stunning movie about worker takeovers at factories in Argentina. And we have an interview with a man named Lalo Paret, who's with the Movement of Recovered Companies and also was a part of that movie. And he had this great phrase. He said, you know, hunger made us unite. This model of not having a boss wasn't optional, he said. It was just the best that we could do at the time. But he does go on to say that this set up an amazing precedent that the organization or self-management of workers or the occupancy of factories is possible, and it's here to stay. I think that's the most important fact for the working class in the world. It's possible to work collectively without a boss. So you now have about 200 recovered factories under worker self-management in Argentina, employing, at the time of the writing of the book anyway, about 13,000 people. But workers also were making their own alternatives by creating cooperatives from scratch. There's a piece in here by a group of women from a working class neighborhood in Porto Alegre, Brazil, who started a seamstresses co-op. And over the 17 years they've been in business, they've actually built it into a whole fair trade network where everybody from the farmers who grow the cotton to the people who manufacture the buttons are, you know, small, cooperative, how would you say, socially just enterprises or solidarity economy. So they have this whole production chain that they're calling Just Thread. So they have occupied in a different sense their space to work and created this alternative. There are people who are taking over not only rural spaces, as with the MST, but spaces in cities. There's a whole homeless workers movement in Brazil. One of the examples we have in the book is a community called City of Plastic that is home to about 200 families in San Salvador de Bahia. And they've taken over empty land, vacant buildings, and they're part of the whole network of urban occupations in Brazil. And in Colombia, in a very strife-torn part of the country, there is a community that has established itself. There's a whole network, actually, of them, but the interview in the book is from a peace community called San Jose de Apartador. And in the middle of the conflict, they've set themselves up as a community that is not going to allow arms in. Very diverse representation of people there, but running under their own governance as a peace community because they needed an alternative to war, again, taking their space. I think one thing that really also stands out about these is that for the most part, they began by mass nonviolent direct action. They're occupations, but they're occupations on a very large scale with a very concrete purpose, not for the purpose of protesting or making a statement, but they're occupying to build community, to find places to work, to really, to survive, essentially. But people were not afraid to go outside the law and risk being arrested and come back and be arrested again in order to establish their communities. And finally, in these autonomous spaces, people are developing alternative and more horizontal forms of governance. Participatory democracy, if you will, is really the model. And of course it varies from place to place, but that is the kind of system that they're trying to set up. There's a really interesting quote from the young woman leader from the MST named Anna Hanauer, who talks about how, she says, we begin with one important principle, which is participation. In both the encampments and the settlements, we organize the people in base nuclei made up of 20 to 30 families each. The coordination of the encampments and settlement is made up of the coordinators of the base nuclei. And she goes on to explain a little more about that. But she says, agrarian reform is the immediate objective of the movement, but our central theme is the Brazilian Revolution, or socialism. So our struggle for our agrarian reform needs to project socialist values, including the form of organizing, participation, practicing how socialism is going to be. So they see their practice of organizing as also a way of prefiguring the society that they want to bring into being. There are a couple of other very interesting examples. I'll just give you a real quick hit on one of them, and then we'll stop so we can have a conversation. In Ecuador, in Quito, a group of homeless families waged a struggle for 15 years to establish a housing cooperative in this area called Ichimbia, which means under the cross of the sun. It's a very beautiful area at the top of the hill, but which had been abandoned for many years. They took it over and started squatting there, and they did every kind of tactic imaginable to win the title to the land and get to build there. So they built houses. The police came to evict them. They chained themselves. They made a human chain with bicycle locks around their houses, and the police had to cut and cut and cut to get them off. Another time, the settlements were torn down. They came back and rebuilt them. They, at one point, buried themselves in the ground up to their necks to express that they were not going to be. They used the media very strategically in this. They used the networks that they had through belonging to other social organizations in Ecuador, and even called in international solidarity to make the case to the government that they needed to stay there. They ultimately won out. There's now a cooperative there that is home to, I'm going to say, about 400 families, and also running in this kind of horizontal fashion. And the person who Cliff interviewed, Milton Chamorro, had been the coordinator of this project overall for a while. And he had some interesting big comments on the subject of power. He said, today I'd say I believe we have to take the two powers, building the one, our own, and taking the other, which is power of the state. But it will have to be a different state, a socialist state, a human state, a state in solidarity. So here at Nichimbia, we've eliminated the big power, and we're left to build a popular social power, you could say, the power of solidarity, the power of dignity, a power where we can embrace each other, take each other's hand without fear or any kind of problem. Because you don't convince people with speeches, but with concrete things. You have to educate people, but with real things, like housing, building houses, like healthcare, the building of a healthcare center, and work, the creation of micro-businesses. That's the kind of power we're building, and Ichimbia is an example of that kind of power. So, do you have anything to add?
I don't think so. I think we could take some questions now though, and see what people...
Do you have questions or comments or other things you're curious about?
Hi. You talked about just now. You're talking about massive nonviolent direct action and the power of that, and I agree that that is a power that hasn't been used enough, and we resort to military force to try to accomplish goals, as a country of the Western world does. So how do you get to that tipping point where you get enough people that are fed up, pissed off, oppressed enough to say, yes, I'm going to do that? And do you see that ever happening in the United States, that we'll reach this point of cutting off food stamps and gasoline prices going up and no child care, no health care? And do you ever see that we will get enough people to truly have a nonviolent revolution through direct action? And it's a big question, but I don't know if we will ever get there. So in the situation, what country were we talking about specifically, Marcy?
Well, these are examples from a lot of different places. So the rural land occupations are in Brazil, and the example of the people last example was from Ecuador. Recovered factories were in Argentina. So they're really different examples around the continent. But we have in our history in this country some pretty solid examples of nonviolent direct action. If you look at the way the industrial unions were established in with sit-down strikes, that's a form of occupation, that's a form of mass nonviolent direction. The civil rights movement.
Right. You can find examples, but
so I think that it happens when people are really pushed, and I think now you're seeing it goes by the name of resiliency organizing. At least I've heard it called that, where people are starting to try to build these kind of local alternatives. Like there's a lot going on in Detroit, where people have been really up against it and are taking vacant lands and making gardens. And you see it in the movement against foreclosures, where people are staying in their homes and their neighbors are coming to defend them. So I think there are seeds of it, yeah. But I think it seems to me in this that the key is necessity, really, that people are doing what they have to do. And I think also when people really stop believing that they can somehow make the system work for them.
Just an observation, it seems like most of the time when that's happened around the world, it's because the central government has lost some of its power for whatever reason. And go back to Tsarist Russia, just too much pressure. And right now it seems like one thing that's happening here is the government has a huge amount of power, but you can see a lot of cracks in the thing. They almost lost the budget last October. And there's a lot of stuff like that. So eventually, if they can't afford to pay for food stamps, if they can't afford to pay for unemployment stuff, and that's creeping around. If hyperinflation happens with oil prices, it might drive things up radically. And if the government starts cracking like that, it seems that's when anarchy or chaos might happen and things might happen. But a guess is that it would happen like that more likely. That's just a guess, that things will break down and there will be organized, there will be just chaos.
Yeah,
That's a guess.
I think we saw that things can change in a second, like with Occupy. They changed for a few days. And so, that's an indication that things can change in an instant. And so, but this is a whole other discussion and from somewhere else. And
I'm curious about the kind of the post-industrial or post-colonial future for Latin America. The way that's described it, they're basically extractive economies that, with the governments, facilitating that, whether, some governments, use some of the surplus to help people and others to enrich themselves. But that ultimately, that's not a stable economy for the world. It's not healthy for that. So what is, are we envisioning, kind of autonomous, isolated communities that just support themselves and aren't involved in international commerce at all once you get past the extractive stage? What's the vision really that goes beyond this extractive economies?
I wish I could say I could see a vision that goes beyond the extractive economies. Chavez was proposing that with ALBA, and he was proposing development of Latin America with oil. And but at this point, Venezuela is in really serious economic difficulties. Really serious economic difficulties. Just as an example, the bonds, the average price of bonds in Latin America is 4.6% on the debt, right? The government sells bonds. Venezuela is now at being rated at effectively a failed state at 14%. Wow. So, and the insurance on Venezuela on those bonds went up 33% in January alone. So we're looking at a country that was posited itself as the director of Latin American unity and development, and it is hasn't even managed to develop itself. They were trying to get away from the import economy, importing all their goods, and now they're far more dependent on imports than they were when Chavez first came in. They're now about 80%. So
is that the result of incompetence and mismanagement, or is that the result of the response of the developed community saying we're going to screw you if you're
no, it's incompetence and mismanagement, unfortunately. I would argue, and it's simply because it's an internal problem. They're the ones who are importing. They haven't developed their agriculture. They haven't developed anything. They've de-developed their industries, their alternative industries. When they were manufacturing cement, for instance. Their cement is now producing. Their nationalized cement companies are now producing at 30%. So what's happening is internally. If you look at the internal dynamics of the country, they've totally wrecked the economy essentially.
And you think that's not sabotage of the?
Oh, I'm sure that there is some. I'm sure that the bondholders are shorting the bonds now. I have no doubt about that. That they can see that here's a sure bet you can short the bonds and short the economy, and that you can make money on that. So there is this sort of snowballing effect, but you have to have something really. It's sort of like the way plant diseases happen. When the plant gets weakened, then everything just comes in and eats it all up. That's what we're seeing now. But you have to have a weakened plant to really do that. And the problem of the mismanagement is enormous. We could go in for hours about that, but maybe tonight we can get into that a little bit more. But, so I don't really see any kind of a vision for a post-extractivist future. In fact, what's happening is the countries are tending to nationalize the resources. So in Ecuador last year had their oil spill that went into a tributary of the Amazon, and it wasn't Chevron. So the good news is that it wasn't Chevron. The bad news is it was Ecuador. And so to the native people who are drinking the water out of the river, it's oil from Chevron, it's oil from Ecuador, but it's oil. So, and I don't really see there's talk about developing from all extractivism, and that's the logic that they put out for why we need to do this. But I don't see any evidence that they're building up, doing the old ISI, import substitution industrialization, the way they did in the 20th century. There's no evidence at all of that now. So.
And I think also that's a big chunk of the answer. And the other part is that it's not a line of questioning we pursued far enough with the people we've interviewed to really know within the social movements, but there are examples of communities that are looking to find ways to support themselves that are not relying on extractive development. And within among the social movement actors who we talk to, there are groups of activists who are trying to plan for more ecological development, and then some of the conflict with the governments is trying to put these policies into power and get a voice for them. But that's still very much a work in progress. So I don't think that the entire vision is just these little autonomous communities. I think, as I said, that these are things that come up that people are building new models and they're doing what they need to do. But there's also not a real coherent voice for this in politics at the moment on sort of as an overall vision, if that makes sense. There are people who are thinking about it. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I'm glad people are thinking about it. We should think about it here too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of us are, actually, yeah. It's wonderful. An inspiring thing. Any other questions or comments or?
Excuse me. In the climate change situation, there's some evidence that the northern hemisphere is going to warm up more quickly than the southern hemisphere, and that's partly because of the fact that there's much more methane available in the northern hemisphere to cause warming. And so one possibility for Latin America, particularly, or South America, I guess, and southern South America, I guess, is the fact that they may have some opportunities. I mean, we're all going to expire at some point, but they may have a little bit longer to go. And there could be a migration pattern that could develop, particularly for people that can afford to do it. And so that may be a source of development for them.
Well, buy our book
Should they
and
want
find out
it?
all of it. Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't know about that.
Other questions, comments?
Could you tell us a little bit about your sources and how you developed the connections that you made?
Well, in one case, the man, the campesino from the campesino movement of Paraguay, I was trying to find him for about 3 weeks or 2 weeks, I guess, and was getting really desperate. And then I came home back to my hotel one evening. They said, "Oh, there's a guy who's in the room next to you, and he's looking for you." And his name is Jorge Galeano, and I thought he was the man I was looking for. So serendipity. A combination of serendipity, research on the road in the buses, reading the newspapers, people who knew what was going on, and having connections with people in different countries. And in the case of Ecuador, it was a guy from this couple from this organization called the Minga Social. They did communication work with all the social movements, and he said, "Okay, here are the 5 people you need to talk to." And he said, "And I'll take you, okay, we're going to go here today, tomorrow we'll go there, and we'll go there, and then the next day we'll go here and there. Okay, you ready?" And so yeah, that was, and we got into all the places. So it was very, very fortunate. So yeah, that was, and then having I'd been kind of interested in trying to follow things for years, and yeah.
Is there any communication between, or did you find evidence of communication between these different autonomous groups? And I was going to ask you about Alabama, but I guess you've already sort of answered. I was wondering about there. With the, Chavez is trying to get the governments together through ALBA. And I'm wondering now with this grassroots movements, like in El Salvador or in Nicaragua, are they talking with each other? Or is there any solidarity or information going back and forth?
Via Campesina is one really, really good organization. There is a lot of transnational organizing. It's really exciting. I think that one of the strange qualities of Latin America is that as ex-colonies of Spain, most people know more about the United States or Spain than they know about the people next door to them. So it's one of those peculiarities of the region, and it's sort of that's been broken down to some degree by greater interest in the region that's developed as a result of the governments getting together. But in terms of the grassroots organizations, it's still really hard to break that barrier and know what's going on in other countries, I think. It seems to me, but Via Campesina and a lot of these international organizations are really.
Yeah, and there's starting to be international networks of groups who are working against mining. There have been some intercontinental indigenous encuentros that have happened, including actually one very famous one in 1992 for the 500th anniversary of the conquest, so to speak, or the discovery, quote unquote. So there are different there are different networking. One of the people who we talked to in the book, Maria Vicente Davila, who's a community organizer and popular educator, has done a lot of work with women in the rural areas of Venezuela, and she's participated in international gathering of campesino women. So there is networking that goes on, but not as much as there really needs to be. I mean, that was another thing that some of the very visionary folks we talked to were starting to say, just, you know, on an analytical level, some of the problems they're having with the governments are really are just due to the limitations of governments operating with such a strong transnational capitalist class. And so, of course, then the alternate, the counterpower to that has to be the people's organizing, but we're obviously very early stages of bringing that into being.
My friends were asking me, well, when is it going to come out in Spanish? And sorry, I don't know that it's going to come out in Spanish, but
let's see if I can form it. First of all, I appreciate the concreteness, the on-the-ground, taking of that space. But I'm up here. I'm sorry. I'm just focused on capitalism because I mean, look, any nation, even the nation state that tries to develop some just system. I mean, I'm going to look at Mossadegh or Allende or Zelaya or Cuba's under constant assault, and it's just like I want to get to that big bad ogre, So anyway, it's not really a question. I'm just I want this to be a path to lifting that off of us, but it's hard to have hope, and we have a short amount of time with this climate situation. So anyway, I'm done. Comment.
I'm just wondering if any of the students in the classroom have any questions.
The only stupid question is when you don't ask, so please feel free.
I was kind of wondering how you saw, how do you think Latin American culture contributes to these movements that they're having? Is it purely out of necessity, or does the culture itself kind of push towards this kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I often have mused on the fact that in Anglo-Protestant United States, we have such difficulty bridging over just even knowing who our neighbor is, whereas in Catholic Latin America, and it's a difference. I mean, Weber's talked a lot about this in Spirit of Capitalism, and the idea that we're all individually saved here. Whether you're a Protestant or not, you're living in a Protestant culture, very Protestant culture. And in Catholic Latin America, the idea is that no one, you're baptized a Catholic, you're going to die a Catholic. Come on. And if you're a Catholic, you're part of the community. And as a community, and then on top of that, you have a culture, because of the Catholic, again, that people intermarried rather than the Protestants came in and they had to sterilize the country of the indigenous people in order to live here. The way we sterilize our gardens of all the pests. It's the same mentality. I remember even being in an agroecology, the Paulo Freire Agroecological Institute in Barinas, Venezuela, and I was talking there, and I was thinking to myself, so enlightened, and I said, some people, we were talking about working with the, nature, and I said, well, how do you get rid of the pests? And they looked at me like, are you crazy? Well, we don't get rid of the pests, we work with them. And I said, you work with them? Well, could you, he said, yeah, of course. It's that mentality of mine, well, you kill the pests. And then you have your whole garden full of zucchini, right? No, you work with them. And so it's a very, very different way of looking at the world. And then there's the indigenous on top of that, because of the intermarriage of Catholicism with the indigenous culture. And in Bolivia, one of the interviews I keep going back, these are all written like stories. They're all written because Marcy, when she sat down and I said, okay, yeah, why don't you come into the thing with me? Okay, the first meeting was, it's got to be written, we got to get the story. I said, well, some of these aren't stories. No, they're all stories, she said. And I keep going back to the one story that Pedro Portugal Molinero, who is an indigenous man in Bolivia keeps talking about, our view of socialism, we see the right and the left as just two forms of colonial impositions on us. Our socialism that we want to build here is based on the individual. And the individual is part of a family. And that family is part of a community. And that community is called IU. And that IU is part of other IUs. And so so that's how we build community. We go out from the individual. We don't buy your idea of socialism. And if you compare that with Lenin's idea of taking power at the top and imposing top down, it's a very different conception. So I think that might. And Minga, there's a word that I came in contact with first in Colombia. It was called cayapa in Venezuela. But along the Andes, the word travels all the way down, even down to Paraguay, where there is no Andes. And we're talking about the low-lying areas of the Guarani. There's a word, and it goes from Minga up here. The Guarani call it Minca, and it's a form of work, collective work, so that when the someone he needs his barn raised. That's what we did here in the United States. Everyone goes over there and helps him raise the barn or get his crop in. It still happens in rural United States, but it's called Minga, and it's the idea of working without any self-interest, working for the community without any self-interest. So that kind of socialism that is part of the culture, and is part of our culture here in the United States. That's what I think they have the wisdom to go back to. We are so divided between our ideologies. And this is where I think we look at adversarial oppositions. They look at complementary oppositions. We see night against day. We see male against female. We see the right against the left. They see the right and the left. They see the woman and the man. They see the night and the day as all part of one world. Now, you take that in one direction, it becomes fascism. But you take it in another direction, it becomes Andean socialism, perhaps.
All right, so I think we're just around time. So what we can do is, I believe you have books for sale?
Yes, we do.
So Cliff and Marcy will be here if you'd like to speak with them a little bit longer or to perhaps purchase a book. They'll be around, but we want to honor everyone's time and say thank you very much for coming out today and sharing your time with us. And we hope that we can see you at further NRA's events. And remember again, if you'd like to have a longer conversation with Cliff and Marcy this evening, that'll be at the Unitarian Fellowship at 7 p.m., showing a bit of a film that they've been working on, talking about some of these events. So please come out to them. There'll be a potluck dinner and it'll be a festive event put on by the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So let's thank Marcy and Cliff for coming to share with us.